Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving into a history that is, quite frankly, deeply unsettling, but absolutely crucial to understand. We're going to track the dark, evolutionary journey of eugenics. It's a cautionary tale of how the language of science can literally be weaponized to justify prejudice. And we're going to follow this thread all the way from respectable 19th century lecture halls, straight through the horrors of the Holocaust, and right up to the incredibly complex ethical debates we're facing today in 2026. As your guide, I want us to unpack this step by step so we can really grasp how these ideas shaped our past and how they threaten to shape our future.
Right off the bat, let's get perfectly clear on what we're actually talking about here. Eugenics is a pseudoscientific movement aimed at improving the human race through controlled breeding. And I really want to stress that word, pseudoscientific. While it definitely borrowed the terminology and the authority of real science, at its core, it was fundamentally rooted in societal prejudice, not objective biological truth. Keeping that definition in mind is absolutely foundational for the history we're about to explore.
So here is the massive, provocative question that's going to drive our whole conversation today. How exactly did an idea dreamed up by Charles Darwin's cousin eventually lead to the unimaginable atrocities of gas chambers? And even wilder, how is it actively fueling modern genetic debates right now? It seems like an impossible leap, right? But as we track this chronologically, you'll see just how efficiently and tragically this pseudoscience spread.
Let's start right at the beginning with the origins and the literal meaning of the word well-born. To figure out how this all happened, we have to travel back to the late 19th century. Our story kicks off in 1883 with Sir Francis Galton. Now, Galton just so happened to be Charles Darwin's cousin, and he became completely obsessed with Darwin's work. But here's where things went off the rails. Galton took Darwin's theories of natural selection, which were only ever meant to describe nature, and he misapplied them to human society. He genuinely believed that human genius and talent were strictly hereditary. He's actually the one who coined the term eugenics to describe his grand vision of steering human evolution. Now, what's really fascinating here is how quickly Galton's initial idea fractured. Originally, he proposed what we call positive eugenics, which was basically just encouraging the best people to have more kids. Sounds simple enough, right? But human nature being what it is, the movement almost immediately pivoted towards something so much darker, negative eugenics. This was the active, aggressive effort to prevent anyone deemed socially or genetically unfit from reproducing at all.
Which brings us to our second chapter, the American movement.
You know, this is a part of history that honestly shocks a lot of people, because long before these ideas ever reached Germany, eugenics found a massive, completely mainstream home right here in the United States in the early 1900s. Just look at the targets. They were going after the poor, the disabled, ethnic minorities, and anyone they slapped with the label feeble-minded. But the real kicker is who was backing it. This was not some fringe underground movement. It was supported by deeply prestigious institutions like Harvard University, and it received massive funding from the Rockefeller Foundation.
The bizarre normalization of all this just totally seeped into everyday American life. Seriously, picture this. You're at a state fair, right? You've got judges handing out blue ribbons for the biggest pumpkin or the healthiest cow, but right next to them, at fitter family contests, actual human families were stepping into exhibition tents to be judged and awarded medals based on their supposed genetic quality. It was just completely woven into mainstream American entertainment. And that mainstream acceptance didn't just stay at the state fairs. It climbed to the absolute highest court in the land. In 1927, the U.S. Supreme Court heard Buck v. Bell. This case challenged a Virginia law that allowed for the forced sterilization of institutionalized people. And incredibly, the court upheld that law. Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. delivered the ruling, and he wrote these infamous, chilling words. 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. With that single ruling, the forced sterilization of countless Americans was legally validated.
And that leads us to the grim reality of Chapter 3, the Nazi horror.
Okay, it's absolutely vital to get this straight. The Nazis did not invent eugenics. They actually looked across the Atlantic, took American eugenics, and pushed it to its most lethal, horrifying extreme under the banner of racial hygiene. And the escalation was terrifyingly methodical. Step 1, they rolled out American-inspired sterilization laws. Step 2, they moved from preventing birth to actively taking lives through a so-called euthanasia initiative known as the T4 program. And Step 3, that exact medical and bureaucratic infrastructure paved the direct road to the industrial-scale genocide of the Holocaust.
To really put this into perspective, we have to look at the sheer scale of the tragedy that happened before the death camps even started operating. Under that T4 program, acting completely under the guise of improving the German race, the Nazis murdered roughly 300,000 people who had physical and mental disabilities. The scientific language of eugenics was the literal justification for this mass murder. Naturally, after World War II and the horrifying revelations of the Holocaust, the word eugenics became utterly radioactive. The global scientific community publicly scrambled to distance itself from the term. But here is the stark reality. While the movement itself went underground, the actual legal frameworks didn't just vanish. These laws lingered on the books for decades. California didn't officially repeal its forced sterilization laws until 1979.
Moving into Chapter 4, we see a quiet but major pivot, the population control shift.
So while the word eugenics was carefully dropped after the war, the underlying philosophy just quietly morphed. It shifted its focus toward developing nations under the banner of neo-colonial population control. International organizations started pushing these massive sterilization programs. They specifically targeted indigenous women in places like Peru, Puerto Rico, and India, very often without getting anything close to full or informed consent. And how did they justify it? They neutrally framed and heavily promoted the whole thing as a necessary measure for fighting poverty.
Which finally brings us to Chapter 5, right here in the present day. 2026, the new eugenics?
Technology has advanced so incredibly fast that these old, complex, historical debates have been completely revived. Think about the contrast here. In the past, we had state-mandated eugenics, right? Driven entirely by government force, coercion, and rigid sterilization laws. But today, in 2026, we're looking at consumer eugenics. This isn't driven by the government. It's driven by the free market, individual wealth, and revolutionary gene-editing tech like CRISPR. We now have the actual capability to not just edit out devastating diseases, but potentially select for desirable traits like intelligence or height. And that leads us straight into what's often called the Gattaca fear, named after that famous sci-fi movie. Here's the modern dilemma. If genetic enhancement and CRISPR become commercially available but are incredibly expensive, they're only going to be accessible to the wealthy. The fear is that we might accidentally create a permanent, engineered biological class system. We'd effectively be fulfilling the wildest dreams of those 19th century eugenicists, but doing it through the invisible hand of the free market instead of government tyranny.
But in direct response to these advancing technologies and these resurrected philosophies, we're seeing some really powerful modern pushback, most notably through the neurodiversity movement. This movement makes the case that differences in the human brain, things like autism or ADHD, are natural, valuable variations of the human genome. They argue these are absolutely not defects that need to be cured or edited out with CRISPR or eliminated from the gene pool entirely. It's a massive, fundamental debate over what even makes a healthy or ideal human being in the first place.
As we wrap up this explainer, we really have to sit with the stark historical lesson we've just mapped out together. Eugenics, when you get right down to its core, is the history of what happens when a society decides that some lives are inherently more valuable than others. It's a straight, terrifying line of weaponized science that started in the polite drawing rooms of Darwin's cousin and ended in the unspeakable tragedy of gas chambers.
Which leaves us right here, staring down the future. In 2026, as we literally hold the power to rewrite our own DNA, we are forced to confront our own reflection. Do we actually have the societal wisdom to use these incredible tools to improve human health without losing our fundamental humanity? Or, blinded by the shiny promise of perfection, are we really just picking up a high-tech version of Francis Galton's old toolkit? It's a heavy question, but it's one we all need to be thinking about right now. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep asking the hard questions.